This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Audience, I am thrilled to be in conversation with attorney and distinguished professor of the practice of law, Joyce Vance. I reached out to Joyce, almost a year ago now, and a lot has happened since that time. Joyce at the time shared that she loves talking about issues at the intersection of public health, institutions, and democracy. As a U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama from 2009 to 2017, nominated by President Barack Obama and unanimously confirmed by the Senate, Joyce brought together communities to solve problems. Today, she's a professor at the University of Alabama and a legal analyst for MS Now. She's also a podcaster, co-hosting Sisters-in-Law and the new Sisters Sidebar and the Cafe Insider podcast with Preet Bharara. In 2017, she received the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Public Health's Lou Worcester Public Health Hero Award for her leadership in creating a community-engaged initiative to address the heroin and opioid epidemic in northern Alabama. She is the author of the 2025 book, Giving Up is Unforgivable, and of the newsletter on Substack, Civil Discourse. Joyce, thanks for your patience with my long intro. There's a lot to share. Joyce, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast.
I am so excited to get to be with you. This is just great. Thank you for having me and for the lovely and overly generous introduction.
Okay. Every Saturday, you and I are together. You didn't know it, but I listen to Sisters-in-Law and now on Wednesdays to Sidebar. How did that all come to be?
You know, it was very organic and it's sort of a fun story. So my podcast co-hosts are Barb McQuaid. Barb and I were U.S. attorneys together during the Obama administration. Jill Winebanks, who we had gotten to know doing legal commentary at the station formerly known as MSNBC. And of course, Kim Atkins, who's also a lawyer, but we were all like amazed because Kim had made the jump and had become a journalist, first a Supreme Court reporter, and now she's an opinion columnist for the Boston Globe. So the four of us would sit around and have these really intense conversations in the green room or some grouping of us. And at some point, the idea just evolved. We should just do this as a podcast. Our conversations were fierce and they were fun. I always walked away feeling better and more powerful. We wanted to share that with an audience.
Audience members, friends have sometimes said to me confusedly, I like your guests, but like, why a lawyer or why an author or why a restaurateur? And so I tied in your intro about you have done quite a lot of work in the public health space and you work with public health leaders, physicians. Some of your work has been in gun violence prevention. Some has been the opioid epidemic, also with reproductive health and the incident with an abortion clinic.
Yeah. So, I'm a career prosecutor. I went to the Justice Department in 1990 and did a wide variety of criminal cases. Spent about a decade as an appellate lawyer. I ran our appellate division. And then I was appointed during the Obama administration. I was the political person after being a career person for so long. And something that changed in that job, which had responsibility not just for individual cases, but for thinking holistically. How do we prevent crime? How do we prosecute crime? How do we help people who've been to prison avoid recidivism? So that whole three-legged stool that required balance, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that prosecution alone could not solve the crime problem. And public health was a logical partner. And I had the great good fortune of going through Leadership Birmingham early in my tenure as a U.S. attorney. And one of my classmates was the guy who ran public health for the county. And we were in a small work group together, saw a lot of overlap, ended up doing a program that was essentially for young moms who were low income, who didn't have good access to information and building apps that they could use, an app in connection with a Birmingham, just a really talented, young, very, very mobile company. And so building public health information into their information ecosphere. And so I'll just tell you what led me to believe that public health and law enforcement were partners. It's a difficult story. It's maybe a trigger warning story for people who have loved ones who are addicts. One of my oldest sons, I've got 4 kids, the first year that he was in college, one of his friends overdosed and died on heroin. She was at home in Shelby County when that happened. And the week after her funeral, I happened to be at a meeting with the sheriff in Shelby County, Chris Curry. And I said, "Oh, Chris, did you hear about this young woman? It's such a tragedy." And I said something like, "She's been at school in London. She must have gotten addicted there." And he turned and he looked at me and he said, "Joyce, she didn't get addicted in London. I know who sold her the heroin that killed her. It's somebody in Shelby County." And I had done one heroin prosecution as a young prosecutor, probably 15 years earlier. I would have sworn we did not have a heroin problem. And I said, "Chris, is that isolated?" And he said, "No, I have a problem." And ultimately we sat down with sheriffs and police chiefs from Jefferson, Shelby, and Tuscaloosa counties. I went around the room and I asked each of them that question: "Do you have a heroin problem?" And they would say, "Well, I've got this one apartment building that's eaten up with it, but that's it." Or, "I've got this one corner." By the time we got around the room, they just said, "Wow, we have a bad problem that we didn't recognize." And my very, very conservative, pro-prosecution criminal chief at the time had this wonderful epiphany that we could not arrest our way out of that problem. So we created a community engaged initiative. We did prosecutions. We prosecuted the hell out of every major seller we could get our hands on. We took them off the streets to give the public health initiative time to work. And our primary goal was to really destigmatize addiction and recovery. We worked with some great folks, did public service announcements that I vetted extensively with the high school kids. And then with younger kids in my neighborhood, I swooped them all up on a rainy afternoon and said, "Watch these and tell me which ones work and which ones are stupid." And we ended up with some really great public health spots, award-winning spots that I was proud of. We saw in that community engaged public health / law enforcement initiative progress we could have not made with prosecution alone. So I'm sorry for the long story. It's just to say, I believe that that's true for gun violence, for a lot of other areas. We need to get out of our silos and learn to work together.
100%. And what you just described is a beautiful example of healthcare design and human-centered design. Bring stakeholders to the table, iterate, discuss, bring perspective, different industries, but all centered on diagnosing the issue, solving the problem, coming up with solutions. And it may not be the perfect solution, but it's been iterated and brainstormed such that what the end product is better than had you not done that exercise. And we know diverse teams are productive teams with better outcomes. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful example.
We had so much support from the medical school at the University of Alabama at Birmingham when Selwyn Vickers was there. And he and the university leadership, they were engaged, but so was the business community because they saw upside in their labor pool. So were educators, and so were parents and families who were dealing with the problems. I just was so impressed by the work our community did.
Yeah. And, my own experience in the emergency department, depending on the year and depending on the location, there were certain sort of commonly used, abused drugs that patients were presenting with use disorders. And most recently in Philadelphia, it was heroin. And, the devastation is real. And I carry Narcan in my bag and I've used it on the subway. And I never thought that, usually when you're on shift, you're on shift. When you're off shift, you're off shift. But I have realized the importance and for me, the commitment, the privilege of making sure that I can use tools as needed when I'm not just on shift.
Our county public health guys here, really, addiction was so stigmatized that Narcan was not widely available in Alabama. They ended up writing a statewide availability prescription so anyone could get it. And one of the most touching stories that I heard was a guy who was in recovery who got Narcan and carried it, saved another addict's life. That's what good communities do when people are struggling. And the understanding that recovery is not linear, I think helped so many families.
I brought up 3 epidemics in one, which wasn't fair. So we talked about the opioid epidemic, gun violence, and then reproductive health.
You're right. I skipped the second two, and I didn't mean to give either one of them short shrift because they're so important. Look, Gun violence, we need legislatures that are brave, that have the courage to involve safe gun measures that we all know work without infringing unduly on the Second Amendment. You don't have to be all one way or all the other. I'm a lawyer. I am a little bit of a textualist, which may surprise people because I'm very liberal when it comes to social issues. But when it comes to the law, I always start with the text of the statute. And it seems to me that a statute that was designed to make sure that Americans could have muskets doesn't necessarily mean that everybody needs to have a semi-automatic assault weapon in their closet. So I think there's a lot of room for legislatures. And then, of course, we come to reproductive health and the absolute assault on women that we have watched shape up when we should be celebrating more advances, when we should be expanding women's equity in communities. I think this is far from over. There was reporting last week, for instance, that conservatives are now beginning to move to seriously challenge Obergefell, the landmark decision that guaranteed marriage equality. But that same thread of legal reasoning can also be used to attack, for instance, access to birth control and family planning. Even information about family planning and sending it through the mails could ultimately be criminalized if people go back to this 100-year-old law that hasn't been used in recent history because it's just sort of nuts. But if the culture leans that way, I think culture is always upstream of the politics. Right now, we're certainly seeing culture drive the politics, which in turn drives law. It could be a very dangerous era for women. And it's the reason that we need these sort of community engaged, community support procedures in all of these areas. Gun violence, there's no reason that what we did with heroin and with opioids couldn't be used for gun violence and should be used. And then for reproductive health care and understanding it. And, I had this moment where my, I don't think he'd mind me telling the story, but my 70-something-year-old OBGYN told me how disturbed he was that abortion was no longer being taught, because he viewed that as life-saving care for his patients. I mean, a very deeply conservative person. And at the same time, he discussed the problem of taking that viewpoint publicly in this day and age, and his concern that, for instance, his family would be ostracized at church for just expressing that medical point of view. We live in a tough time. We have to all have the courage to stand up for what's right and do what we can to educate our communities.
I ask my guests, when did you realize you had a voice and when did you start using that voice? So Joyce, tell us about your voice.
I would say, and it's interesting, I'm sort of glad you warned me that the question was coming because it's not something I've ever thought about a lot. If you work for the Justice Department for as long as I did, you realize that public service is an unbelievable privilege. I worked in an office full of just I can't tell you how wonderful people were. Many people will know Doug Jones, who was my boss for several years when he was the U.S. attorney. Doug was a great boss. I try to not say nice things about him because then he sort of gets ego-laden. So Doug, if you're listening, just plug your ears. Doug was great. He taught us how to do things the right way, and then he supported us unconditionally when we did it. And that was such a wonderful way to work. And because of Doug's patient teaching, I went into the job as a U.S. attorney. He and I talked a lot when I was headed that direction. I understood that I had an obligation to use that platform on behalf of the community. And for instance, on civil rights issues, which really evolved, I think, for me into a larger understanding of civil rights to include public health and equity issues. And so I was conscious at that point that I did have a public voice in Birmingham that I can use. What took me more time to realize, and I think it's because we lived in an era where we had a brand new president in 2017, Donald Trump, who was progressively committed to tearing down the rule of law, that the public was very eager to hear from people who had had the experience at places like the Justice Department or other places in government. And I was initially very hesitant. I just thought, who am I? I'm just like a former U.S. attorney in Birmingham. What right do I have to talk about these issues? And then I realized that the experience that I had had, that the access, the opportunity to view these sorts of processes, going and working properly during the Obama administration. I was so lucky to have had that I had the obligation to share it, and people were genuinely interested.
You referenced your elder OBGYN and sort of this hesitancy or fear of repercussions. And I think many people who don't use their voice have this, and that we're in a specific time period that fear can be real. Gloria Steinem came on the podcast and I asked her about voice and what would you say to people that are afraid? And she looked at me like, well, you have a voice. Why wouldn't you use it? And so I'm wondering your relationship to any fear using your voice or speaking your truth or, even on the podcast.
I mean, I just don't think we can afford to be fearful or to give in to fear. Look, federal prosecutors, I mean, maybe we're hardwired a little bit junky in that regard, because occasionally people do get a little bit hacked off that you're prosecuting them. And particularly, I used to do Dixie Mafia cases. They would sometimes make noise about ending your ability to prosecute them. And so that sort of thing happens, but you can't go through life being afraid to do what's right.
Yeah. And so that even leads us to your book and the title, Giving Up is Unforgivable. So here it is. And before we get into what's in the book, tell us about the design. I'm interested in the color palette and in the jacket. And, it's red, white, and blue, but even the white is a little bit of a pinkish / off-white. So did you get at all into some of the graphic design aspect of the book?
So let me just say that I had absolutely nothing to do with the cover of this book, which was the brainchild of my incredibly wonderful publisher. I had such a splendid relationship. I published with the Dutton imprint at Penguin Random House. And they were like so nice. I mean, writing your first book, it's very vulnerable, right? And I wrote this wonky, nerdy book about legal history and the civil rights movement. And I thought, well, maybe 5 people will read my book, but it's been so enjoyable for me to have the time to research and think about it, to have them show up with that gorgeous cover. It's sort of embossed. It feels really good when you touch it. It was, maybe this sounds a little bit silly, but it was very validating. It made me feel very, appreciated and cherished. And I love the cover of the book, but it was all them, not me.
Tell us about the title.
Giving Up is Unforgivable. It's something that Joe Biden said after Kamala Harris lost the election. It was just a throwaway line in, one of those wonderful Joe Biden, the healer kind of conversations that he had with the public after the loss when we were all feeling a little bit down and out. And it occurred to me that it was exactly the right thing to say, because I bet you remember this moment. After Kamala lost, people who had worked their hearts out for her election were really giving up in droves. I had a lot of conversations, especially with women who said, I did everything that I could have done. I left nothing on the table. I give up. There's nothing, nothing else that can be done. And my reaction was it would be absolutely devastating for the country if Donald Trump returned to power and if there was no one there to hold him accountable. And so I felt really an obligation to express that view, which I did in like an 800-word essay one night on my Substack, Civil Discourse. And a few days later, publisher called me up and said, hey, would you write a book about that? And fortunately, I didn't know any better. I didn't have the good sense to say, no, I can't write a book. So I sort of dove right in, not really knowing what I was agreeing to do.
How are you different having written this book?
I'm super appreciative of my 4th child who came home having graduated from college and was looking for a job and who agreed to let me hire him. And I hired him to manage my world. And what I learned from writing and having, my youngest kid, my baby, as sort of the manager of the whole enterprise was how important it is to have people that you can depend on unconditionally. I'm not someone who, I have 4 kids and I worked, the whole time my kids were around. And something we haven't really talked about is our 2nd kid was born with a really serious genetic condition. So there was some angsty years tied up in his situation. And I'm not very good at relying on other people for what I need. But in this moment, I needed to have somebody that I could rely on for help. And that has really made me very thoughtful and I think better at building teams and relying on people and just saying, you go do this piece. And that's, maybe I should have learned that before I was 65 years old, but I'm glad I learned it now. And so it was a good exercise for me to write in long form. But honestly, that sounds very self-centered. And in a way it is. It was a very indulgent exercise for me to have the time to write the book. And unlike a lot of my friends who hated writing books, and this might be a little bit like childbirth, right? Where you forget afterwards how horrible it was. But I really enjoyed the research and writing stage.
Yeah. I will say, as a recipient of this book and reading it, for me, it was, in the emergency department as a lifestyle medicine physician, we're breaking perhaps medicalese, speaking medical, into, lay terms so that people understand. And I found this a perfect, readable primer on our country, democracy, the Federalist Papers, and really filling in gaps that I missed in my own elementary and middle school education. And so it was, for me, highly readable, very fun, relevant examples, and just a really good, like I said, primer. It just filled in a lot of gaps and explained to me how we are where we are today and why democracy is at risk and why it's time to double down and lean in. And so you have actually talked about civic education, civics, and bringing that back. I've spoken with personal finance experts. They've come on the podcast because I think financial health is a part of being healthy and taking
Yes.
care of yourself and taking care of your loved ones, et cetera, et cetera. So speak about the importance of civic health.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing every day right now in front of us is that communities that are healthy are better able to fight for democracy, right? Because when we say fight for democracy, we don't want to take up guns. We don't want any violence. We want the opposite. We want civic courage to enable communities to push back in smart ways where everyone can stay safe. And, I really think that Minneapolis will be a touchstone, that future generations will talk about the bravery and the courage and the commitment to doing what was right that the citizens of Minneapolis showed when they were under attack by a federal agency, when Donald Trump sent, shock troops from ICE into that city, not for a legitimate reason, right? Folks may remember that the articulated reason was that there was a lot of fraud being committed by the Somali community. And of course, that was really demonizing an entire community with a very broad brush. There had been a fraud prosecution that the U.S. Attorney's Office was very capably handling in Minneapolis. And one of the ironies is that the fallout of Donald Trump's lawless deployment of ICE in Minneapolis was that those senior career prosecutors who had been doing the fraud cases felt compelled to resign rather than to participate in what they believed was unlawful activity. So, in other words, no reason to deploy ICE. It was a political maneuver. Maybe it was payback to Minnesota's governor, Tim Walz, for having had the temerity to be on the Democratic ticket as the vice presidential nominee. Maybe it was the fact that Minnesota didn't vote for Donald Trump. But for whatever reason, the community there came together, and they, as we say these days, they understood the mission, and they have stood up, as have other communities. I was in Maine during the ICE deployment there. Something that I thought was tremendously impressive was the way there's a huge Somali community in Maine, which always surprises people. Many of them are citizens, right? Most of them are. They've been here for so long. Some have temporary protected status, but just regular, ordinary people in Maine were going and packing up food to be delivered to the homes of Somali American citizens who were afraid to leave their homes. That is courage in a community, and that kind of courage is contagious.
Yeah. You've been described as unshakable, having an iron will.
My
and
mom would have said, damn stubborn.
And cool under pressure. Honestly, Joyce, you sound a bit like an emergency physician, very decisive and clear. And I think for audience members that haven't heard your voice, based on what you just shared in terms of our time, the importance of democracy, civic health, there is clarity. I want to pick up, what you offered and tell us about your second son and through that, your interactions with the healthcare system. And now it's tying together public health, the healthcare system, your own lived experience.
Yeah, so our second son was born with something called the DeGeorge anomaly. We did not know that at the time. All that we knew was that about 12 hours after he was born, he could not hold his body temperature and he looked blue. And that very quickly evolved into a diagnosis that he had some pretty traumatic problems with his heart that were going to require almost immediate open heart surgery. And then we learned in the next couple of weeks that he didn't have much of an immune system, and that made the diagnosis for DeGeorge, which is sort of a developmental anomaly, pretty clear. And we were told a lot of different things. Some doctors opined that he would not ever learn to walk or to talk. The heart surgeon who did his open heart surgery, a wonderful, wonderful man, told us he could not make us odds on whether he would survive the surgery. We had a great cardiologist, and he said to me, you're going to have a normal, mouthy 2 or 3-year-old riding around his trike, annoying the hell out of you. And so we sort of held on to that. Birmingham, Alabama has great medical care. Teddy's godfather, who was here in Birmingham at the time, his older brother is a cardiologist at Johns Hopkins. And we talked to him and we said, where do we need to go? And he said, don't leave Birmingham. You're in good hands. Which is to say, we had, in a bad situation, the best possible outcome, and we had access to medical care because I had federal insurance. We learned that not every family who had a kid with the DeGeorge anomaly was that lucky, and that there were some tragic outcomes because of that. And so I'm a big advocate for breastfeeding. I think it's really important to support breastfeeding moms. And I just don't understand why in a country like ours, we can't provide at least a standard of medical care for everybody.
Yeah. And how is he today?
Well, his cardiologist was dead on the money. He was a normal 3 or 4-year-old riding his trike around and annoying the snot out of us. And he has not had an easy time. It is difficult in many ways. And he had a lot of developmental delays, but he's college educated. He's smart. He's funny. And we're lucky to have him.
Thanks for sharing. I'm going to take us back to civic health and civics. And I like to leave our audience with micro skills, small actions, behaviors that they can take when they finish listening to us today. So, call to action. What can people listening, people watching us do when they shut off this episode in terms of engaging in civic duty, engaging with civic health, gaining an education in civics?
Number 1, make sure you're registered to vote. People wouldn't be trying so hard to make it difficult for you to vote unless they understood how important your single individual vote is, combined with the votes of the people around you. And there's a concerted effort to make it more difficult to vote right now. The first thing you have to do is register, and you should go do that today. And round up your 5 best friends and make sure that they're registered too, and take them with you to get registered. It's going to get more difficult to register as we get into this year. There's an effort to pass something called the SAVE Act, which would require you to prove that you're a citizen to register to vote. And that probably means having a passport. And that's expensive. I'm in Alabama. I know a poll tax when I see one. They're trying to make sure that it's more difficult for older people, poor people, students to register to vote. Once you're registered, you got to make sure, and this is number 2, make sure that you stay registered, because the Supreme Court has authorized what's called good hygiene for voter rolls, pruning of voter rolls. And to be clear, that's necessary, right? State secretaries of state do need to update the voter rolls, but frequently they're removing people from those voter rolls for really broad, I don't want to say fraudulent, but for bad reasons. So it's now incumbent upon you to make sure that you are still a registered voter. And I recommend that every election cycle, about 59 days out from the election, that you go online and check. There are a lot of places, right? iwillvote.com or vote.org, and you can check to make sure that you're registered. And if you aren't, you can re-register at that point in time. You cannot be removed from the voter rolls closer than that 60-day benchmark to the election. So that's step number 2. Number 3, have a plan to vote and take everybody with you to vote. I live in Alabama. We get 1 day. It's a Tuesday. That's tough if you're a single mom who's a waitress who eats what she kills, right? If you have responsibility of caring for older parents. My mom was sick for several years, and it was difficult for me to figure out, when am I going to vote between working and being with my mom at night? And so you need a plan, and you need a plan that involves other people. If that means that you have breakfast and vote together, do whatever it takes, because this election, 2026, is when we will rebuild the guardrails that protect this democracy. Returning, I don't want to say democratic, because I think it's more than that. Returning pro-democracy candidates to office who will vote, for instance, to ensure that Congress exercises the power of the purse and the president can't take that away from them. All of these problems that we're seeing, the way ICE agents are masked, which they should not be. We need a Congress that will pass and enforce laws that restore democracy. So, you asked this, I think, open-ended question. What can people do? What are the actionable items? Register, make sure you stay registered, make sure you vote. This is the pivotal year.
3 micro skills. And Joyce, I'll just share Dr. Alistair Martin, who's an emergency physician. He started this initiative called Vote ER, where healthcare workers wore a badge with a barcode. And every time we engaged with a healthcare team member or with a patient, they could put their phone up and check their registration status. So it was such a beautiful public health initiative that I was able to participate in when in the emergency department. It was just like win-win, non-denominational, non-party, just are you registered? Register now while you're waiting for hours in the emergency department.
I love that, and it should go national, because what you just said is the most important part of this, right? Who you vote for, that's your personal political choice. Exercising your right to vote, that's something that as Americans, we should all be able to do. It should be easy for qualified, eligible citizens to vote. And as a U.S. attorney in Alabama, I knew when I did pro-voter work that more Republicans were going to vote than Democrats. That was absolutely fine with me. I wanted everybody to have the opportunity to exercise their right.
Yeah. Joyce Vance, for people that want to follow along, join your journey, what's the best way to keep in touch and listen to and read your work?
Well, these days I write almost every night on Substack. My newsletter is called Civil Discourse, and you can go to joycevance.substack.com and sign up to read it for free. I hope you will. I hope you'll share it with the people around you. I think staying educated is the most important thing we can do right now.
Joyce, thanks so much for joining me on the Visible Voices podcast.
Thanks for having me. I am a new fan. I just love your work so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it.
Joyce, what should the title of our episode be?
Wow. You know, people always make puns about chickens. In fact, my podcast sisters-in-law last week, we had a chicken of the sea title. Maybe we should call it Don't Be Chicken.
Don't be chicken. Dude, that off the cuff, just like that. She's quick. That Joyce Vance, she's quick. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trend spaces. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Find me at Resa E. Lewis, MD on social media, or visit thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and watch our episodes on YouTube. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not reflect the opinions of their institutions. Information shared here should never substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice. Together, we're making healthcare more equitable, one visible voice at a time.